let's now turn to Esther chapter 7. Capítulo 7. Esther chapter 7. Since there have been some heavy themes throughout the series, I thought we'd begin with a nod to the younger ones first by sharing one person's comparisons of Wile Coyote to that of Haman, the villain in our story. Is that theologically possible? Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to try to make it work. First of all, what was Wile Coyote's greatest obsession in life? Is that true? To get the Roadrunner. By the way, what did he want to do with the Roadrunner? Isn't that a delightful theme for a children's cartoon? When you think about it, this guy, don't think about it too much. However, he's never able to eat from his dream menu. That can't happen because the cartoon's creator, Chuck Jones, had a list of rules to be applied to every episode. We'll mention just a few and then make some correlations between that and the book of Esther. First off, the Roadrunner cannot harm the coyote, not lastingly. About all he could do is say what? Some of you know it, right? The old beep beep. All right. And although children watching the show were always free to annoy their parents with that beeping noise for the rest of the day, right? We love to go around doing that. Well, not relating this to the book of Esther, Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman posed no physical threat to him, did it? It was just annoying, like the beep beep in the coyote's ears. Secondly, no outside force could harm the coyote except his own ineptitude. Remember how banged up he'd always get? Nothing could harm, no outside force could harm him except his own ineptitude or the failure of the Acme products that he ordered. Remember, they always turned on him somehow in the end. Now, I wonder how he always got them so quickly before the days of Amazon. Don't you wonder that? How did that happen? I'm going to write Chuck Jones if he were still alive. Now, relating this to Esther, no outside force caused Haman more harm than himself. He was ultimately responsible for his own fate. Finally, the coyote could stop any time, but he was so obsessed with getting the Roadrunner, he kept going despite all the trouble he kept bringing on himself. And day after day, Haman clung to his anger and pride. But just as the coyote could never eliminate the Roadrunner, God would never allow Haman to eradicate his people. Well, who knew that Wile Weskel could make such great theological contributions? So we thank him and Mr. Jones. Last time, to catch us up, we were left wondering if Esther really knew what she was doing. Having gained an audience with the king without losing her life, instead of asking him to save her and her people, she asked the king and Haman to a what? Party, dinner party, banquet, feast. That's right. And when the king arrives, he eagerly asks to know her request, and she says, I'll tell you exactly what it is if you and Haman come to what? Another banquet tomorrow night. You know, when I read that, I thought, what's her problem? Maybe she just got cable installed and she's practicing to compete on MasterChef with all that cooking and dinner party arrangements. Now, you remember what happened the night before the second banquet? When the king got insomnia, he had the book of deeds read to him to lull him back to sleep. And that's when he discovered that a man named Mordecai still needed to be honored for saving the king's life. Now, what was amazing about that timing? Do you remember? What was amazing? While the king was planning on how to honor Mordecai that night, Haman was constructing a what? A gallows to kill Mordecai. Now, Esther and Mordecai were fast asleep, completely unaware of the plan. So everyone was clueless except who, really? Except God. Everyone was clueless except him. But the providential timing we saw last time together in this part of the story was amazing. By the way, I've got to say, National Geographic, speaking about timing, reported that a young outdoor enthusiast named Dylan McWilliams was bitten by a shark, attacked by a bear, and bitten by a snake, all in just over a 3-year period. They say the odds of that happening are 893 quadrillion to 1. That's National Geographic. Why am I telling you? Because the king opening a book filled with 12 entire years of records and just happening to hear Mordecai's particular deed read to him just hours before Mordecai's scheduled execution has also got to have some pretty hefty odds of its own. But listen to this. When you factor God into the equation, there's 100% certainty that the king would hear whatever God needs him to hear. Amen? So, and wouldn't it be ironic, by the way, wouldn't it be ironic if we come to find out one day in the kingdom that the noise of building the gallows through the night was what led the king to not be able to sleep, which in turn ultimately led to him honoring Mordecai, which in turn saved Mordecai's life that day? I'd love to know the answer to that question. But we know Mordecai's not killed. We saw the great reversal with Haman leading the honor parade. Haman implodes with humiliation, but at least he's still looking forward to the second banquet later that night with Esther and the king. So now, we're all caught up and we're ready to move forward. We're at the banquet. To make her request, she will have to do what? What great risk will she have to take? She's going to have to, if she expose her identity, her ethnicity as a Jew. Now, if she does that, she puts herself at great risk because the king's made this decree. So she's got that risk to consider. Also, however, she's going to confront the mastermind of all this evil at the same time. Now, why do I point this out? When we read the story, we know the ending. It's so easy for us to underappreciate the risk that she was taking. Looking back, oh, well, of course, that wasn't so great. Harold, yeah, she made a big request. No, it's easy to underappreciate the fear she must have been experiencing, the risk she was about to take. He was not simply her beloved husband who'd do anything for her. Do you think this guy was just some hopeless romantic, just willing to fall all over the place to do anything for his wife? Don't we already have a track record with this guy of what he could do, what he's capable of with his wives? No. So listen, I want to give you a taste of the man she was really about to put her life into, his hands, all right? I want to give you a taste. History tells us there was a man who had given King Xerxes a large sum of money to help him fight against the Greeks. We've mentioned some of those battles earlier. He had also entertained the king in his own home on a number of occasions. All 5 of his sons were in the army preparing for war against the Greeks. But this man wanted to pass on his family name, so he asked the king if he would kindly release his eldest son from military duty. And he thought, look, after all I've done for the king, this just can't be too hard, too much to ask. How do you think the king responded? He took that eldest son and had him cut in half with a sword. Then he had his army walk in between the 2 halves. This is the kind of man Esther is married to. This is the kind of man she's about to entrust her secret to. So why does she do it? What could possibly convince her to risk her life by telling the king that she's Jewish after knowing what this man has done, knowing what he's capable of? Well, the evidence is strong that Esther had taken Mordecai's words to heart and came to believe the safest place for her in all the world was to be identified with God's people. Safer than the palace, safer than being the wife, the most powerful man on the planet, is being one of God's people, for all God's promises were with them. So, they're at the feast. Once again, the king says in verse 2, what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom will be granted to you. Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant my what? Grant my life. Grant my life. This is the petition. You've wanted to know, what is my great request? This is it. Grant my life. Now, up to this point, the king has no idea what she's talking about, but already you can imagine his blood boiling at the thought that someone was out to kill his queen. It wasn't all adding up yet. She goes on, and spare my people. This is my request. For we have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have bothered you. I want you to notice, she uses the exact wording from the decree. All right? Destroyed, killed, and annihilated. She's careful to avoid placing blame on the king. If she had come with guns blazing with blame against the king, he would have gotten defensive to save face. And in another strategic move, she says, King, I wouldn't have even burdened this with you, but if all your subjects are destroyed, this isn't just slavery, this is genocide. And if all your subjects are destroyed, think of all the loss to your kingdom, economic and otherwise. Do you know what Esther's doing here? She's being shrewd without being sinful. And in verse 5, the king is enraged. Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. Esther answered, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Can you imagine? Just put yourself in the shoes of Haman for a sec. Can you imagine he's there thinking that he's still favored, even though he was humiliated by leading that honor parade for Mordecai? He's still favored by being brought to this private dinner party, and yet now, right before the king, he's being exposed and accused as the very one that's out to kill the king's wife and all her people. And just the horror that must have been. Now, I've got to ask you something. Do you think the king was truly shocked, or was he feigning and he actually knew? Up to this point, like, what? What are you talking about? So, no right or wrong answer, because none of us really knows. I'm asking for opinion, really. Shocked? How many say he was truly shocked? How many think he probably knew? How many aren't sure? Every week, about half the audience doesn't want to commit because they think it's a trap. There's no trap. It's just for fun. Okay, just for fun. All right. Well, I got to tell you something, though. Did he know that she was Jewish? No. So there was room for shock, wasn't there? There certainly was room for shock, but there's possibly more to it than that. The Hebrew word from the decree is the word, destroy, and it's a homophone for enslave. Do you know what a homophone is? Those are words that sound the same, but they're spelled different, but they mean different things, all right? And they're spelled differently. We have loads of them in English, such as he ate a veggie burger, or he ate 8 veggie burgers, right? They sound the same, but they are different words. He ate 8 veggie burgers. Now, some believe that when Haman sought permission to kill the Jews, he purposely used an ambiguous word that misled the king. Haman could have made it sound like he was merely asking permission to enslave a certain people group, not destroy them, especially since he offered what to the king to do it? It sounds like, King, let us enslave this certain people, and there'll be certain advantages to it, and to seal the deal, he offered him money. Remember that all of that silver. So, that could have happened, but what about the explicit wording of the decree? Destroy, kill, and annihilate. How can you confuse that with slavery? Well, listen to this. Have you noticed how spontaneous the king can be? He doesn't care much for details. So, he truly may not have known if he left all the details of the decree to Haman and his officials. So this theory is plausible. In any case, what do we know? The infuriated king storms out into the garden, probably trying to figure out how he could save his wife and punish Haman without looking bad himself. After all, he's the one who gave Haman permission to write the law, even if he was duped to some degree. But now, look at the desperate position horrible Haman finds himself in. If he runs out, if he scrams, he looks what? He looks guilty. If he follows the king outside, well, that's probably not the best time for that. So, in another great reversal, the Persian falls before the Jew, pleading for mercy from the queen. Now the king returns inside, both furious and confounded. What can he do? But Haman has made the king's decision easy. By Persian law, no one was allowed within 7 feet of the queen. But when the king saw Haman leaning on the couch with Esther, even though he was pleading for his life, the king saw what he wanted to see, the excuse he needed to resolve the dilemma. So he cries out, will he even, did I do that right? Oh, something didn't pop up. Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house? Instantly, guards move in. They actually, it doesn't show in the picture, cover his face, not even giving him a chance to speak. But what do the guards say? They say, Mr. King, Your Highness, listen to this. There's a 75-foot pole near Haman's house that he just had built to hang Mordecai, the man you just honored. So what did the king do? He ordered Haman hung instead. Not only that, as the chapter ends at verse 10 that says they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. You know another crazy thing about this that I find strange? As surprised as the king may have been, Haman probably didn't know Esther was a Jew either. Is that possible? He may not have known that either. Listen to this. Sin often has surprising and unintended consequences. Think about this. Would Haman have pursued the death decree if he had known Esther was a Jew? It's hard to imagine. Would he have pursued it? Something we do know for sure is that sin never lets you know that it's leading you into a life-ending trap, either physically, spiritually, or eternally. And that's why, out of love and mercy, Scripture never ceases to warn us. And that's why we have our Scripture reading from Proverbs 5, which says, "A wicked man's iniquities will trap him. He will become" what? "Tangled in the ropes of his own sin. He will die because of his own great stupidity." Did Haman get tangled up in the ropes of his own sin? Absolutely. Sin compels us to think only of ourselves and lies to us about the consequences, while holiness compels us to think of others and fulfills its promises of life and joy. But for a moment, I want you to look at all the irony here. Haman pleads for mercy even though he's unwilling to extend it to others. Life only mattered when it was his own on the line. Something else. He ultimately fell on one Jew, Esther, because another Jew, Mordecai, would not fall before him. And what he devised to kill another became the device that destroyed him. But now I want to get into something a bit heavier. We started with some light fare, but is it okay to challenge the saints sometimes? Is it all right? I think this is one of the hardest parts of the story and the book, but it requires some gut-wrenching honesty to get something out of it. So here's the first question. Honestly, how many are relieved Haman was stopped? Please raise your hand. If you're honestly relieved, Haman, only a few of you. All right, that's okay. I'm going to give you one more chance. How many of you are honestly relieved Haman was stopped? Not even half. Why? Those of you who are not relieved, can you tell us why you're not relieved for that? Anyone want to be so bold? You just want me to go on. Okay, I will. I will go on. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Okay, there's more to it than that. How many are relieved he was stopped and got what he deserved? How many are just going to be brave enough to say that? Okay, thank you for your honesty. You're relieved. You're being honest and saying, I'm relieved that he was stopped and he got what he deserved. Now, that is a little tougher for us to admit, but true or false? At some level, we all desire judgment and or justice. How many of you believe that's true? At some level. All right? All right. Way more of you are raising your hands. Good. After all, who doesn't want to be compensated for their work instead of cheated? If you were cheated, you'd want justice and judgment, right? Or who wants the Hitlers of the world to remain in power and never be punished for the misery and death they've caused? Who really wants those tyrants to continue? I'd go so far as to say most of us, I believe, are thrilled to see horrible Haman finally stopped. The tricky point becomes, how much should justice stop him? Is jail enough? Or execute him, just as he clearly had planned for Mordecai and the Jews? Why is the question of justice not always easy to answer? Well, for one, we're always told that we should be merciful and forgive, right? So that's the thing, be merciful and forgive. And aren't you glad for that? Imagine if we only demanded justice and never forgave. Or imagine if we only forgave but never required justice. There's a theologian named Miroslav Volf who helps bring some perspective. But before I share a quote from him, how many of you can at least have ever had a situation where you cried out to God for justice? You said, Lord, please intervene and right this wrong. Have you ever had anything like that? Lord, please intervene and right this wrong. This was so unfair. I don't know if it was at work, at school, a family, a tragedy, but you begged God, you cried out. We have a picture of the saints. Remember the martyrs under the altar in Revelation crying out for justice. How long, O Lord? It is not wrong. Let me ask you, is it wrong to cry out for justice? No, listen to this. Miroslav Volf, he was involved and studied the genocides like in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and he talks about how hard it is to imagine a God who isn't angered by these atrocities. And he says, though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. Do you believe that? Can you accept that? I believe that's quite powerful. Do you want a God who doesn't want to stop wars and rape and slavery of all kinds? Do you want a God who's willing to tolerate the presence of sin and sinners forever? Or do you want a universe where even the presence of sin and all its terrible effects will never be known again? Do you know why we cry out for justice? Precisely because we are made in the image of a perfectly just and loving God. That's why we cry out for justice. Do you know what the amazing thing is? God does offer forgiveness and mercy to the Hamans and Hitlers of the world. He does, if they would only have him. Do you believe that? God does offer forgiveness and mercy to the Hamans and Hitlers. The real problem is not that God just wants to even the score with all his enemies. The problem is that God offers all his enemies forgiveness and salvation, but most refuse it. So God's first move is not justice and judgment. God's first move is always, I want to save you. I want to forgive. I want there to be reconciliation. I want healing. Not judgment, but healing. And the truth is, folks, I look at Haman and I put him up there with the Hitlers and Pol Pots of the world, and he's so despicable, and I get angry, but the truth is, all of us deserve judgment. Not just the worst of us, and not just those who make the headlines, and not just those who appear in Bible stories. Romans 3:23, for all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So here's the good news. In Esther, we see the bad guy get the gallows as he deserves, while the good guy goes free. But Jesus, the truly good guy, gets the gallows, the cross, while the bad guys, you and me, go free. Why? How is that legal? How is that right? Justice is served because Jesus takes all the punishment upon himself. And out of then God's mercy and grace, you and I go free. Like Haman, Satan had his foolproof plan all set up, but in the greatest reversal of all, when Jesus died, it was also the death blow to Satan, sin, and death. Hallelujah? That's the greatest reversal of all. And by the way, after all the cruel injustices in the book of Esther, the great reversals keep rolling in. Start of chapter 8 says that same day the king gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it, can you imagine, to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate. Look at all the reversals. Folks, their ultimate problem had not yet been solved. But nothing has gone as Satan's minion Haman had it planned, but exactly as the Lord had planned all along. Again, that's the God of great reversals, working his amazing providence behind the scenes. And that's why I love this quote: he may be most present when he seems most hidden. Friends, you and I can trust God amidst the worst injustices and unfair tragedies, because the judge of all the earth will one day apply the perfect blend of justice and mercy to all who call upon him. And he says, to anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord, he or she shall be saved, even though you may have been the Haman that God needed to save.